Hello and welcome to Reveal's 2020 webinar series. And thanks for joining us today. My name is Kelly and I'm going to be your host for today's presentation. This year's webinar series, for those of you that have been following us, is turning SAP into an asset as it relates to your business and how each functional area will be affected by S4HANA. Today we set the stage for turning SAP into an asset by effectively identifying and measuring production throughput. Each one of our webinar presentations is going to address how the functional area and processes now and in the future can be transformed to turn SAP into a valuable asset. We invite you to examine your supply chain and consider how you might transform what matters. Before we get started today, our presentation is going to be approximately 30-45 minutes, and we'll have a question and answer period at the end. If you have any questions, please capture your questions in the question or chat section. And then finally, everything will be recorded, so it'll also be available on our website later today. With that, I'm going to introduce you to our speaker, who is Sean Stokey today. Sean is an SAP production planner and a project systems integration advisor here at Reveal. He has close to 20 years experience in supply chain management. And Sean is responsible for educating and ensuring clients are utilizing SAP best practices to support integration across the supply chain and the associated functional modules across many industries. With that, I'm going to hand this over to you, Sean.
Thank you, Kelly. All right, thank you everybody for attending. We understand that it's a pretty dynamic nature, both at work and at home, with the coronavirus going on. I can imagine many of you, just like me, are probably sitting across some kids. So the kids have been well instructed not to join and burst into this room, but if they do, I will do my best to gladly turn them back away. So I apologize in advance if there are any interruptions, but I do not perceive that there will be. My kids have been really great this past 2 days. So hopefully you guys are able to adapt and overcome as well as we navigate through these rough waters, if you will. So with that out of the way, what we're going to do today is discuss throughput in relation to SAP and how to best pull that value out of SAP. I know that everybody is very in tune to the KPI of throughput, but if you're like many other organizations, you may be questioning how to actually get that out of SAP and how do we actually use SAP to derive that value? What are some of those standard reports that we can get to and customize to really pull this value out? And what are some of those prerequisites that are required to get to that state, right? So if we're using standard SAP, what do we need to do to ensure that we're really deriving that value? So we'll go through that as well. And then once we've gone through those prerequisites, we'll talk about how we really use this tool to do two things. And that first one is to hone in on manufacturing efficiencies or inefficiencies, if you will, and focus on those exceptions. And we'll talk about exceptions and what that means at a later stage. Really, there's two types of exceptions. We'll focus more so on the manufacturing exceptions that we see and we can derive from this report. The other way this tool is used is really for a continuous improvement model. And I'm sure every organization out there is anxious and willing and already has some lean manufacturing principles in place that may reside outside of SAP. But again, how can we use SAP to give us that same functionality, to give us the visibility to go out to our MEs or ops managers and so forth and say, hey, this is the work center that we need to focus on. This is our bottleneck. Go out there and de-bottleneck that line so our throughput throughout the entire system increases. And so we'll look at that and then we'll wrap it up. So first and foremost, what is throughput? There are many variations of this definition. I believe the most well sought after, the most clearly defined one is APIX. And this is probably the most simplified version, so we'll go with that for now, and we'll dive deeper into that and what that means for SAP shortly. But clearly, the rate at which the system generates goal units. That is it. That is all throughput is. Now, when it's expressed in time units, predominantly for manufacturing, that's units per month, units per week, units per minute. The rate at which those units are going through that work center or resource, if you will, in SAP. Now, the goal unit is money. Again, this is, I'm sure, if anybody who has read the theory of constraints, everybody's well in tune with money as the goal unit. Money is per time period as well. But to really get to that benefit of increasing throughput and as money as the goal, we really need to take a step back and focus on those work centers, those resources, really where that work is being done, and start de-bottlenecking there before we can really derive some of that benefit at the money level. So the focus on this presentation will be at the shop floor, so where that work is actually being done, but also elevating that information up throughout the organization so we can make key decisions throughout the business to really derive and increase that throughput overall, even if your goal is money. And of course, at the end of the day, we all know everybody's goal unit is money. But for this presentation, we're going to focus a little bit more on again, the work centers and the resources where that work is being done and what SAP can really do for you. So with that, SAP, at least in its standards, does not directly measure throughput. So I want to put that key statement out there. So there are some things that you can do, especially as we go into S/4HANA in terms of modeling, in terms of advanced modeling and so forth, where we can start doing scenario planning to truly take a look at what throughput looks like through the entire system. But as it stands now in ECC, at least, we can't really measure throughput. But what we can do is measure throughput time. And again, throughput time is really just your lead time of your manufactured materials. So throughput time is the measure for that material to pass through the manufacturing process. So when that material goes through and it gets staged on the floor to the time that it gets sent off to the next operation or the next order or shipped to the customer, that time right there is the lead time or the throughput time of your material or of your order, or however way you want to define it. Now, it's important to note that lead time goes into your ATP. It goes into literally everything that you're promising to your customer. So it's extremely important that that throughput time is accurate. And if you have MEs working on this, I'm sure that's probably one of their primary responsibilities, is going in there and making sure that the lead time of that material is correct. But are they looking at the right data? Do they have the tools required to really ensure that they're going out and seeking and looking at their lead time variances, their input-output deviations, and so forth? Or are they working in Excel and have these very robust Excel structure, these spreadsheets to do the work that's already in the system? So with that said, throughput time consists of really 4 or 5 key metrics. The first one is process time. Process time is the act of doing the work. Whatever it is you're doing in that work center, it's the time it takes you to build product A or build tool B, or for that chemical to go through that work center. It is the work that's actually being done. So it's important to note that one as well. That's defined in the routings. We don't go into detail on that in this webinar, but there are some other webinars that go more into detail about what that looks like and where that is clearly defined. The other one is inspection time. There's move time and queue time. So inspection time, move time, and queue time in the world of SAP are really non-value added time. It's all that time that material is just sitting there. Even if it's inspection time, it's just sitting there. You know, we know inspection time is critical if you actually have it. It is a must-have, but it's still time that is just sitting there. It's accumulating dust, if you will. It's all that time that really amounts to no value whatsoever when it comes to lead time. But all that stuff does go into the lead time calculation in SAP, whether or not that's defined up front in the master data or that we see it in the actuals, and we'll get to that in a moment as well. So it's very important that when we look at these process time, inspection time, move time, and queue times, not only are we defining it up front accurately, but also we're measuring it afterwards. And how do we measure that? Are you able to measure that now? And we'll show you how you can with standard SAP. So when we reduce the queue time, what we're doing is we're increasing manufacturing efficiency. So all that stuff on top, the process time, wait time, inspection time, move time, queue time, take all that, add it up, divide it by process time, and there's your manufacturing efficiency. And this is one of the key KPIs that I love to look at when I'm optimizing production lines, is what this manufacturing efficiency looks like. Again, that's all great and dandy, but how do we do that in SAP? And I'll show you how that is derived here momentarily. To do that, we can derive that from really two reports within SAP. One is the operational level. One is the header level of the production orders or process orders. When we look at the header level of our orders, whether again that be process order or production order, we can't really get into the level of granularity that you can at the operation level, but we can look at things like plant, order, material, date. If we dive deeper into the operational level, which is a different report, and I'll show you that structure momentarily, then we start getting into that granular level. We can start looking at that work center, or that operation, that date that operation is actually being done, and really drive into some very, very, very valuable information when it comes to throughput. Because again, that throughput is being done at the work center level. So that's where we really want to focus this effort, or that resource if you're in the process industry. So to get to this information, we really have to look into what SAP calls the logistics information system. And so what is that? If you're like me, it took me some time throughout my career to actually understand what this is. But this is one of the most valuable concepts in SAP reporting that it has to offer. And really all it is a collection of tables, data, and so forth. It's put into this info structure that contains an ungodly amount of key measures, if you will. All this information, key figures that we can use to customize our reports to give us a slew of information that is extremely relevant to our processes, whether that's the sales information system, it's purchasing information system, inventory, or what we'll focus on is the shop floor information system. And really, that's everything that involves production. So if you look at your COIS report, your COIS, or if you look at some of the other reports, our MCP1s, MCPUs, all these other reports that we'll get into in a moment, that really allow us to drive into data at a granular level or a macro level as well. And so all that is the LIS system. The LIS system gives us the ability to hone in on some of this data and some of these key structures. So within these information structures, this table of data, if you will, there's really three kinds of information that we'll find. We'll find the characteristics. Characteristics are like your plant, your material, your orders, for instance. You'll have a period of unit or a time reference, so your week, your day, your month, your quarter, and so forth. And then you have your key figures. So some of the key figures we'll look at in this webinar are your target lead times, your input-output deviations, your actual queue times, your target queue times, all this stuff that's really being done at the shop floor. But in every single one of those areas from before, the sales orders, the purchasing, they all have their own key figures. But for the production area, we'll look at key figures that pertain specifically to production and that are relevant to this conversation. So out of that, the two primary key figures that we're going to look at today are the relative schedule deviation and also the input-output deviation. So the relative schedule deviation is really the difference between the target lead time and the actual lead time as derived from the operation and the order level. So this is SAP's term for throughput time. So when we look at lead time in SAP is throughput time everywhere else. So those two terms are interchangeable. They are the exact same thing. They are defined and classified the exact same way. The measures and the formulas behind are exactly the same. So if you're looking at any other webinar outside of SAP, those exact same measures and formulas would be used in SAP as well, just pulling information from different areas. So the relative schedule deviation is by far the most critical in terms of reducing and honing in on that throughput time. And again, I'll show you what that looks like here in a moment. But one more time, that's the relative difference in the target lead time versus actual lead time. And I'll show you what makes up those two in a moment. Excuse me. Input-output deviation, on the other hand, is really a tool that we can use visually to gauge our manufacturing efficiencies. And this is the difference between the target and actual input date of the operation. So if we say, for instance, that we're going to start operation 10 today, but we don't start it until next week, a week from now, and we have 5 or 7 days, depending on how you use your calendars, worth of deviation or input output, you know, we have 5 or 7 days worth of deviation. That's an inefficiency in the manufacturing process that we need to go in and really take a look at why that's actually happening. So this is a really good gauge of manufacturing efficiencies. And when we talk about manufacturing efficiencies, we're talking about exceptions. So when we say SAP is a massive proponent of managing by exception, you know, we have our MRP lists and evaluations, MD06 and MD07, which play a huge part in managing by exception. But on the manufacturing shop floor, when we look at operations and the operational level, we're talking about manufacturing and operations in particular, then we really start looking at the manufacturing exceptions. Those manufacturing exceptions are really derived from this report. And it's really a shame that most of our clients are really not aware that this level of reporting exists. Now, again, you have to go through a lot of prerequisites to get to this state, but it's there for the taking. It's really there for you to utilize. You just have to know what it takes to get to it and then know how to pull that information out using the LIS systems. So first off, we'll go into the operational analysis. So this is a dashboard that we created. Now, anybody can go into standard SAP now and create this dashboard. What you'll see at the top and all the operation quantity, confirmed quantity, target lead times, actual lead times, so forth and so on, are those key figures that we talked about before. So you can go in and pull any of these out and customize this layout to look exactly how you want. So for every industry, some of these things may be different. For instance, on the wait time over there, wait time is defined as a master data element in production. For this client, they didn't have wait time. So for this case, maybe you want to exclude that particular column, or if you did have wait time, you can include it. So what I do now is I'll go from left to right really quickly and show you what some of these columns mean. Columns are defined as operation quantity, confirmed quantity. That's really what are we saying we're going to do at the operational level, and what did we confirm? So if we had 10 pounds that we wanted to produce and we only produced 9, there you go. You have your planned and your actual quantities. When we get into this next set, the target lead time, target execution, target queue time, this is where we start talking about throughput of that work center. And again, right now we're looking at the work center level. So target lead time is, again, all that stuff, the queue time, the inspection times, the move times, the wait times, plus the process time as defined in the routing. It's all that stuff that it's our target, what we say we're going to do. The execution time is merely the process time. The only thing that gets thrown in there is process, and that's it. Queue time, on the other hand, again, as I stated before, is everything that's not process time. So all that queue time, all that wait time, all that hold time, inspection time, all that stuff that's non-value add in SAP is queue time. And the reason they want to do this is they really want to show you how much time is really wasted. So this allows us to start going into the system and really seeing where we can optimize, where are our bottlenecks. The next 3 columns are your actuals. So where's our actual lead time? You know, when we started that first operation to the time we confirmed that last operation, what is the time between point A and point B? And that's all that is. The actual execution time is how much time do we spend making that product? So again, we have a target execution time and an actual execution time. We have a target lead time and actual lead time. We have a target queue time and an actual queue time. The next column is the relative schedule deviation and the input-output schedule deviations. And I'll get back into those in a moment. We talked about it briefly a moment ago. These next five columns are purely just master data. And so the reason why I like to show these is because these are a really quick view of really finding some outliers in our master data. So if we're looking at a list of work centers and a list of materials, and we feel like these should all be kind of in alignment, we can immediately come in here and look that we have 2.8, 6 hours, 0.6 hours, 1.5 hours, 25.1 hours on those two work centers. So why are those two so special? Why are these two having an input-output schedule deviation of 13.6 days? We can really start honing in on some of these exceptions immediately just by looking down and finding some of these outliers. If you go down a little bit further, you can see 12.8 hours. So what is really causing that? And when you start diving deeper into these reports, you can start looking at the root cause. And we'll get into some of those root causes here in a moment. The two columns that are most important that we talked about in the previous slide is that relative schedule deviation, that input-output schedule deviation. And again, the relative schedule deviation is merely a difference between the target lead time and the actual lead time. So if we're looking at a negative schedule deviation of 0.4 days, that means that we are on average within this work center almost a half a day longer than what we should be. And this is a problem. So I can tell you I've been to a lot of customers where I've seen 10 days, 20 days worth of negative schedule deviation, or on the exact opposite. And so when we have deviations like this, we're either not able to achieve what we're saying to, or we're promising the customer entirely too long of a deviation. So we could shorten that time period. So either we're late all the time, or we're overstating our capacities, and we can really drive down deeper and decrease those throughput times so we can ramp up, so we can really speed that product through there. Because when all of this is calculated, when SAP does it, it takes this stuff into consideration when it lead time schedules. When it lead time schedules, that's what goes into the promise to the customer. That's extremely important. When we're looking at this stuff and we're seeing deviations that are negative 10 days, positive 20 days, this absolutely impacts our customers. And that is really the biggest benefit out of this. Not only are we able to go in there and optimize our production lines, now we can start going in and saying, are we promising our customer too much or too little? And that's a huge benefit. And it's a shame that a lot of companies don't really know how to derive this information. And this is a very standard report. So deviations in here are symptomatic of manufacturing inefficiencies or master data issues. We can immediately go in and see, hey, this process time is 25.1 hours. Should that really be 4 hours, 3 hours? Give it to our manufacturing engineers, let them go look at it and be like, oh yes, we had a fat finger over here that actually should be only 6 hours. Okay, well, there we are. We just misquoted our customer, because again, SAP takes that into consideration when lead time schedules. That is a really big issue. If we drive down deeper into the granular level, there's a slew of information at the material operation, at the date level. We can start driving into some of these key measures and start finding that root cause. And I can't tell you how valuable this information is when we're starting to look at what that throughput is, starting to de-bottleneck these lines. When we have relative schedule deviations that are so far off, this is really a bottleneck issue that we need to go in and rectify. Now, granted, at the planning level, it may not be us that does it, but we can hand this information over to an operations team, or they should be in here daily looking at this information and finding out where they need to go optimize their lines. If they have one work center that has a massive deviation, what's causing that? Is that a bottleneck of some sort? So we have a lot of information, we have a lot of material piled up before that that's causing it. Is there so much queue time that we need to look at? So what are some of those root causes that we can look at? And this report allows us to drive in there and dig up some of those root causes. This is an example of the input-output diagram. So within that report, there's two graphics that we can look at, one being input-output diagram, the other one being the Gantt chart. And really all this is a visualization of your inefficiencies. The farther these two lines are apart, the red and green versus the red and blue, the more inefficient you are as a production line. Now, whether we're looking at the work center, a group of work centers, or a plant, we can immediately see that right now we're inefficient. We want that input-output target or input-output lines to be as close as possible. What we're saying is we're targeting, we're going into the operation at one part or into the order at one part, but we're not starting it till a week or two later. Same thing on the output side of it. This is a massive deviation, and this is a really quick look at our efficiencies. The next one is a Gantt chart. We call this the candy cane because it is white and red. And what this does is it tells us our target and our actual lead times. So for this first order up on top, we have a target lead time of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 days, but we're actually achieving that in looks like 8 or 9 days. Same thing for that next one. So we can go down a list, and again, we can see this at various levels, and we can immediately see from a visual perspective how we kind of stand from a lead time or throughput time efficiency. Then we can go into one level up. Now, this level is not so good for deriving throughput at the work center level, but it does give us target and actual lead times at the process and production order header level. So this won't give us granularity into, again, work centers or resources within SAP, but it does give you granularity into materials. So for that material, not taking into consideration the operations underneath it that live and breathe within it, but at a material header level, what are we really saying in terms of our target and actual lead times? So again, this is just one level up. You don't get the level of granularity, but there's some really great information in here as well. A lot of times we see in clients, we have negative actual lead times. This particular client, we had a negative 5.1 day lead time. This was interesting for us, interesting in a lot of clients, because how can you have a negative 1 day or negative any actual lead time? Turns out one of those prerequisites is making sure that you have your factory calendar and shift calendars in alignment. When those two are out of alignment, you get some kind of funky and wonky characteristics coming out of there. So just making sure the master data is correct and all your stuff is pre-configured ahead of time is also a prerequisite. We'll get into those next. Again, as before, deviations are symptomatic of process inefficiencies or master data issues. But in here, again, you can also drill down by material, order, and date, but that's it. You can't get into the operation level, but if you're a planner, if you're a high-level exec, you probably don't want to get into that level of granularity if you're not a director of manufacturing, or if you're not clearly or specifically manufacturing. If you're somewhere on the other side of the business, but you still want to get an idea of what those lead times are and those deviations, you can still get that at a higher level of granularity than what you would in the order analysis aspect. So now that we've covered that, so how do we prep the system to really derive this value out? So the first part, I should say, this is one of the most crucial ones, is if you saw my webinar last year, and if you have it, by all means, you can pull it out from our website. That webinar is based around moving from repetitive to discrete and why you would want to. Now, why you would want to is exactly for this reason, amongst others, is that the level of reporting in discrete is far less. It is severely constrained. You don't get to look at the order, the operation level in terms of granularity, in terms of lead times and so forth, because everything is there, the cost collector and rates and buckets and monthly buckets and so forth. So you do need to be in discrete or process to get this level of granularity, to look at the work center or the resource level. You need to be planning in SAP. This is the big one. I can't tell you how many clients we go into that have all these massive Excel spreadsheets dedicated to planning outside of, when they could easily be doing this inside the system. If you're planning outside the system, obviously SAP is not going to see this, therefore you're not going to get the benefit out of these reports. When we go into the system, obviously we want to be using production planning best practices, capacity analysis, and leveling. We want to optimize those production lines via production wheels, if it makes sense, putting like tools and paint colors together and so forth, minimizing that setup time as much as possible. But again, we can use this report to drive in on some of those inefficiencies as well. So they kind of go hand in hand and can work both ways. Improving demand planning, really moving from a push to a pull supply chain is not really a prerequisite, but you can definitely get a lot more value out of this report by having a pull supply chain. And again, it's one of those things where we can actually see that within the reports as well and drive to more to a pull supply chain. Apologize. It looks like one of the slides got out of order. Okay, so once we know the prerequisites, we could really start honing in on some of these inefficiencies and really driving to a continuous improvement model. So what does that look like? We'll talk about that next. So manufacturing inefficiencies, we talked about this a little bit before, but really, when I go to our clients, this is one of the key tools that I pose to our manufacturing teams as their daily dashboard, creating a daily habit. So we have two habits that we like to talk about within Reveal is exception, managing by exception. So all those buyers, planners who are living within the MRP world, the MD04, 6s and 7s and so forth. But on the shop floor, on the manufacturing side, they have a dashboard they can use as well. And they have a daily habit. They need to be going into these reports and really seeking out some of these outliers of information and really get to that root cause. So there's kind of two key aspects to this. When a customer or client first comes on this tool, more times than not, their data is all over the place. They have master data that just hasn't been scrubbed yet. So when we first get in, really the idea is to go in and start looking at some of those master data issues and then correcting them. We can immediately go in and look at the time period of the last month or the last year. What are all those materials going through that production line where that master data seems very inconsistent? Look at that, hone in on those inefficiencies and start rectifying that. Start going in there and modifying that data so it's correct, so that we're deriving information out of it. Now, this is extremely important because, again, as with anything, garbage in, garbage out. So if we're overstating or understating our lead times, we're going to have massive deviations. So we need to make sure that our lead times are stated correctly from the beginning. Now, once we've done that, once our lead times are accurate, then we can go in and start looking at refining those lead times. What can we do from a lead time perspective to decrease that queue time so that we're increasing our manufacturing efficiency and decreasing our throughput time? And which work centers do we want to do that in? Because again, you don't always want to increase throughput on every single order, every single work center. You really only want to do it on that bottleneck resource, because it doesn't do any good to debottleneck that first work center if your bottleneck is really that middle work center, because all you're going to do is have a slew of material piled up before that bottleneck resource, and then that one is becoming more and more of a bottleneck. So we debottleneck everything. We schedule on that midpoint scheduling, but we got to make sure we're tackling the right work centers at the beginning. And from there, we continuously hone in and drive on this continuous improvement that we'll talk to next. And again, we immediately pinpoint unoptimized routings and other bad data master element directly from the report. A manufacturing engineer or an ops manager can go into his production line every morning and immediately see, as long as they're doing real-time confirmations, that they have variations, deviations that they need to go in and look at. Driving to a continuous improvement model. For me, this is the biggest bang for the buck. As I said before, when we start going in and we have all this information and all this data scrubbed and clean and our lead times are accurate, we can really start going in and pinpointing those bottlenecks. Now, you can, of course, do that with capacity analysis and CM01 if you're used to that. But now we're looking at a much more granular level with quantifiable data. I can't stress that enough. When we talk about inefficiencies and bottlenecks, we can now quantify that. So a manufacturing engineer or ops manager can then go to his planners or his directors or his VPs and say, hey, look, 9 times out of 10, or throughout this month, throughout this quarter, throughout this year, this resource or this work center has this much deviation, and here's the data behind it. That is so powerful from an operational perspective to have that level of data, to have that level of quantifiable evidence. because we can go out there. If I'm working on the shop floor, or if I'm doing my walk in the morning, I can go see that, yeah, this work center is not really, it's not up. The machine's not running right now. We have a lot of material beforehand. This must be a bottleneck. That's great. But how do we quantify that? How do we quantify that? So when we go to our, start doing our return on investment, start making a business case for it, what is it going to take? Do we need to invest in more resources? Do we need to have in put in some capital expenditures to increase capacity? Now we can quantify that. Now we're giving the business the information they need to make those key decisions. And that's where that continuous improvement model really comes into play, is that we can go in and we can debottleneck and debottleneck and debottleneck with quantifiable evidence. Again, by deriving it straight from the system with standard SAP reports. And this is invaluable information from a manufacturing perspective. So with that, we'll wrap it up. And if anybody loves the Ford Shelby, which I do, I don't have one myself. It would be nice to have. But we have this analogy we like to have with SAP when it comes to this. This is pretty much when you have a constrained, when all your pistons aren't running on the same, so we have one piston down, right? You're kind of unconstrained. That's your bottlenecks. You want to go in there, debottleneck it. And once you unconstrain it, there's so much power that you can get from it. This thing is flying down. This production line is flying. There's very limited deviations. And that is really the value out of this. So when we utilize standard SAP within the system, we can hone in and eliminate waste within the production lines. That queue time that we talk about, we can eliminate it. It may not eliminate it completely. There may be some that we must have, that inspection time. But again, we can hone in on those, identify those, and reduce those as much as possible. And when we do that, we drive a continuous improvement model aimed at constantly reducing manufacturing lead times. And when we constantly reduce manufacturing lead times, we're able to promise to our customers sooner. We have more velocity. We have more throughput going through that entire system, which at the end obviously gets to our goal units of money. And that's why I think most of us are here today. What can we do to get to that end goal unit of money? Well, we need to take a step back, go to a granular level, debottleneck our resources, identify, hand it off, do some continuous improvement models, bring that out, and really start driving to that continuous improvement model, both quantifiable evidence and data within SAP standard, without having to create any custom reports, without having to develop anything. This is standard SAP. You can do it today as long as you have your data correct and as long as you have some of those prerequisites in play, which are all standard, by the way, as well. So that is my section, my webinar now opened up for questions and answers. I think Kelly will take over at this point.
Thank you, Sean. And it looks like we actually do have a couple questions for you. Somebody had asked, you mentioned that discrete and or process is a prerequisite. Can we not use these reports with REM?
Okay, again, yeah, that's a good question. So as we stated at the beginning, no, when we talk about REM, really we're talking about buckets of time. So if you go into SAP and you start looking at the reports that are available, there's only, I think, 3 or 4 key reports available for REM. None of those will give you the level of granularity, because again, when we talk about REM, we're not thinking about planning at the work center level. We're really just working with planned orders, which is also the other key aspect. When we work at planned orders, we're not getting actuals in terms of operations and work center level of granularity. So it is absolutely crucial to move from repetitive to discrete. But again, the business needs to be mature enough, and they need to be able to take the steps necessary. And it is a big business decision to move from repetitive to discrete and or process. And it's not something that should be done lightly. It's something that should be guided. But it needs to be a business decision throughout, and finance is also very heavily engaged in that as well. So good question. No, we can't get this level of granularity, but we could if we move to discrete or and or process industry.
The next question is someone is wondering where these reports are located and where they can find them, and are there any other reports you can recommend they can run?
Good question as well. So the question was, where do we actually find these reports? So again, if we, I wish I could show you in an SAP now. If you go, these are standard reports. They're in the LIS. Every section of SAP in the menu path has a section dedicated to reporting and production. I believe there's approximately 15 or so orders, reports dedicated to the production area that focus on shop floor. They focus on operational level, header level. You can do your production reports via COOIS, your COOIS report. So there's definitely a slew of reports that we can use. I cannot recall off the top of my head each and every single one of those, but again, I do believe there's about 15 or 15 or so that are extremely valuable, that are all standard, that I can guarantee 9 times out of 10 outside of COOIS, most customers probably, or most clients aren't truly aware of, but they are absolutely visible within that standard menu path. So you don't have to go in and dive and think of transactions. They are standard within the LIS system.
And it looks like our last question, what if our master data has not been vetted for accuracy? Can we still use the dashboard?
Okay, so if our master data has not been vetted, right? And again, we find this in a lot of our clients, and this is part of the optimization process that we typically go through when we come on board, or you can take this initiative on yourself. But that optimization, it needs to happen, but it doesn't need to necessarily be a prerequisite, because we can use those dashboards to really drive in on those master data discrepancies. So again, as I showed before, we had that 25.1 day input output deviation. Did that lead to was the routing information bad? Was the processing time incorrect? I'm sorry, I misstated. It was the process time that showed 25.1 days, not the input output deviation. So if our process times, when we go and look at these reports, if we're looking at a work center and we have 10 materials that go through it, and 9 out of the 10 have a process time of, let's say, 2 days, but you have one material that has 20 days, well, does somebody just add a 0 to the end? Because again, that 0 to the end is going to go into SAP's scheduling formula, and it's going to promise to the customer 18 days more than what it should have. So no, you don't need to have that information scrubbed prior to, but you can absolutely use this report to drive to creating master data that is accurate. So again, there's 2 types of information that we can get out of it. One is these manufacturing inefficiencies. So are we confirming on time? Are our confirmations correct? Or is our master data incorrect? Or our process times, our queue times, our wait times? We've been in clients before where we've had wait times of 2 days, for instance, that are set at the work center level. When you set a wait time or a queue time at the work center level, it automatically populates in all the routings that are attributed to that work center. So if you have 2 days defined at the work center, it defaults, and unless the manufacturing engineer goes in and overwrites those 2 days, those 2 days are calculated into the lead time for every single material going through, or at least defined in that work center that hasn't had a routing that's been updated. So there's lots of ways that you can use the report to really drive in on that and use it to scrub your master data. But by all means, you would want to do that first before you can really start driving in on some of those bottlenecks and some of those queue times, those lead time deviations that we want to go into next to see where we're least efficient, where we have the most amount of queue time, and start debottlenecking those. Debottleneck that highest priority one, then start driving into the next highest priority, the next highest priority. And you start doing that, your job should never be done. You should always be striving to continuously reduce the queue times, continuously improve your manufacturing lead times, your throughput times, because when you do that, again, you're able to reduce the time it takes to take that material from the start of processing time all the way to the client, all the way to the customer. And so that promise to that customer lead time becomes less and less and less and less. Our velocity becomes higher and higher and higher and higher. And there is the value out of this, out of these reports. So thank
All
you
right,
for.
looks like that. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, that was it.
All right, looks like that was our last question, Sean. But if there are any other further questions, feel free to reach out to us. We'll be happy to get you some more information and have further conversation. Um, so with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and our webinar shall be available on the website later today for you to look over in case you need to re-listen to it on revealvalue.com under the resources tab. And then you'll also find some previous recorded webinars as well as informative content that we have available, white papers, success stories, and some other helpful tips and tools. And our next webinar will be on April 15th, and that will be covering turning SAP into an asset by automating warehouse management and EWM. And that's going to be presented by Steve Cannell. So we'll go ahead and get you out an email reminder in a couple weeks, and hope to see you there. And other than that, let's have a great day, and thanks again for joining us today.